To our Think Big series brought to you by PSG. My name is Annette Hearn. I'm the CEO of PSG Asset Management, a division of PSG. As a leading independent financial services group, PSG has an extensive national footprint in South Africa as well as in Namibia. We've been in operation since 1998. That means we've seen various economic cycles, we've seen interest rates up and down, and we've also lived through various global and local crises. We pride ourselves on providing a bigger picture approach to our clients' financial needs, from asset management to wealth management and short-term insurance. We're an advice-led business backed by some of the best independent financial advisors around the country. The Think Big series is a collection of dialogues with high-value speakers hosted by award-winning financial journalist Bruce Whitfield. Each topic will address human truth issues which are causing South Africans anxiety in these uncertain times. The series aims to empower our audience with factual evidence to formulate their own opinions and manage their expectations on how various aspects of the current situation could unfold. And if I think there's one thing we can all agree upon, it's that during these past few months, the availability of information has been as much a liability as it has been an advantage. We've been inundated with opinions, forecasts, projections, a lot of which has already turned out to be untrue. And we hope that this series of dialogues will help you to distinguish between what is factual, what is possible, what is probable, and how you can plan for a variety of scenarios that could play out. In today's webinar, Bruce talks to Professor Adam Habib. He's an academic, a researcher, activist, administrator, and a well-known public intellectual. A professor of political science, he has over 30 years expertise, so he's also seen quite a few cycles and crises. His professional involvement in institutions has always been defined by three distinct engagements. One, the contest of ideas. Is this a valid opinion? Is this a valid idea? Do we need to challenge it? Do we need to look at it differently? Secondly, their translation into actionable initiatives. How do we put this into practice? It's fine to have an idea, but how do we make this work? And thirdly, the building of institutions. How do we build something sustainable, not just a once-off, something for the long term? Transformation, democracy, and inclusive development are fundamental themes of his research. He's outgoing Vice-Chancellor and Principal at the University of Wits. Our campaign social media hashtag is ThinkBigPSG. Please use it. Our series is free, it's shareable, it's open to anyone interested, whether you're a PSG client or not. Bruce, of course, needs little introduction, and we trust that you will enjoy his pointed questioning, his sharp wit, and his optimistic yet realistic outlook. Over to you, Bruce.
Professor Adam Habib with us now, and 2020, Adam Habib, is probably not the year that you signed up for. You had other plans, I'm sure, for 2020, but it's sort of taken a course of its own, hasn't it?
Yes, it's like kind of 2016 and 15 when we had a protest, except this is a different kind of thing. I thought it's going to be a quiet year. I'm going to ease out of Wits very quietly. There'll be some succession taking place and some process to find my successor. But that didn't happen. After one or two quick international trips, what immediately happened is we were confronted with COVID. And when COVID happened, we had our first case of somebody infected around March 11th, 12th. And that forced us into calling our recess early, a week early. And within 3 weeks, we shifted completely online. Now that's a phenomenal thing. If you just recall that Wits University has been experimenting with online from about 2016. We have about 15% of our academics online. There were many academics and many students opposed to online on pedagogical and other grounds. And then suddenly we had no option. Either we lost the year or we did something and we said we're going for online. And within 3 weeks, we were 100% online. And that took an enormous amount of work, but it also took an enormous amount of political cajoling, because there was a lot of political gains afoot by stakeholders, by government leaders, by protests of one kind or the other, and we had to manage all of that, all in the space of 3 weeks.
I mean, if inequality is complicated on campus, it becomes quadruply complicated in the virtual world, because connectivity is not universal. Devices are not universal. You've got 37,500 students, some of whom are more privileged than others, some of whom can sit in a nice leafy suburb on mom or dad's laptop or on their own iPad and continue as if nothing has changed. You had the opposite problem, though. There are a bunch of students, probably several thousand students, had absolutely zero access whatsoever.
So that's the interesting thing. So we have about 86% of our students have one or other device that is available to them. And then we had about 4,000 or 5,000, 15%, that didn't have any device available. And so that was a real issue. And what that meant is that when we started speculating about the idea of shifting online, we had two groups of people protest, actually three. One was the SRC. And the SRC said, effectively, no, we don't think you should go online. Precisely for the argument that you had suggested, some people are not connected. Other institutions had raised the issue, yeah, but is it fair as a system where some people go online and some people don't? And some deputy minister, Bhuti, the deputy minister of education, went out and said he was concerned about some of our institutions going online. I took the position, as my colleagues did, that social justice is not a reversion to the lowest common denominator. That's not what our struggle is about. Our struggle is to be aware of inequality, not to ignore it, and to mitigate its consequences. And so initially what we thought we'd do is we try and make a deal with ENCA and the SABC if we could use their TV channels. But both of them wanted to give us, they wanted to give us between 11 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning, which kind of didn't work out. We spoke to DSTV, who were prepared to give us channels, but that wouldn't have worked out because people, if you're not connected to the internet, the chances of you being connected to DSTV are limited. And so then we confronted the real issue. It was, okay, let's get people laptops. And so in the middle of a pandemic, I started phoning around to CEOs, and thank God, WITS has all of these alumni, and we were able to procure, in the middle of a pandemic, 5,000 laptops.
However, it's been quite controversial nevertheless, because no sooner do you do that, then all sorts of other accusations begin to erupt. And you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. I suppose, and you've got to do what you've done throughout your career, and that is get some blinkers on, have your goal in front of you, and go forward because you know what is right. And not be distracted by the noise, because what you have had over the last 7 years as Vice-Chancellor of Wits University is a huge amount of noise. Some of it justified, some of it not justified. Some of it young and angry and passionate, and that's what university is about. Some of it deeply disruptive and potentially destructive. Do you think you were going that way?
So I think that there was a threat that we would go that way. I think immediately when we got the devices, people said, well, we don't have connectivity. And so off I got into the phone and phoned all of the 4 CEOs and said, help me out here, can we cut a deal? And they've decided to give us at a price which will be reverse billed to the university, a connection to all 37,000 students. As soon as we did that, some staff said, well, I don't have actual devices and I want it. And so we then negotiated inclusion for them. And then I got the argument that said, well, you got us devices, but I live in a shack. So how do you expect me to live with 10 people and study in a shack? And I said, well, what we will do in that case is we will create boot camps and learning when we return to the university. So we effectively looked at each of those challenges. Now, to be fair, if I didn't have those challenges, I wouldn't have been prompted to mitigate them.
Yeah.
But by prompting to mitigate them, I think we've done something really interesting as a country, at least at BITS and UCT and Stellenbosch and Rhodes, etc. And that is, we did what Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge did by moving the students online. But we did it in a deeply unequal society.
Yeah.
And so we intervened to mitigate inequalities. So when I speak to colleagues in the UK and they hear that we connected everybody or that we provided 5,000 laptops, they are astonished at effectively, first, that we would do that, and then they think that everybody would be at our feet thanking us. And I have to tell them, actually, that's not true. Nobody thanks us for this. They think this is a terrible thing.
But there's a consequence to it. I mean, already universities are cash strapped. Already there are enormous constraints on resources at universities. Suddenly, there is a multi-million rand cost that comes to the university, which doesn't get rebated in any way as far as I can see yet, in terms of NSFAS or any one of the other programs that exist to fund students who need the funding. That's simply to cover the fees. This is an additional cost. What is the consequence then on the academic prowess of its university into the future as a result of what this year is a one-off cost, and quite possibly next year becomes another cost as well, because you've got a whole new intake of students too?
So I think you're absolutely right. But here's the issue. So I think that there's two systemic effects. There's the first systemic effect is a place like BITS or UCT, etc. Mercifully, we ran the last few years at a modest surplus. We were pilloried for it. People said, how dare you? You're making a profit. But that slight modest surplus allowed us to actually have some cash to throw and use in a time of serious need, like we have today. So at least the initial cost for BITS and UCT, I would imagine, and Stellenbosch and Pretoria and UJ, etc., we can take on. Other institutions like Fort Hare or Zululand didn't have that luxury. They were not running at the kind of modest surplus, and they didn't have 15% who didn't have laptops. They had 80% who didn't have laptops. And there what has happened is the state has undertaken to assist. So they're making, through NSFAS and other mechanisms, finding some resources. But that's not the real problem. My real problem is we haven't understood the effects of COVID-19. So as COVID-19 impacts on the economy, the state doesn't have money. And as it doesn't have money, it's going to impact on our future subsidy. But people are also losing jobs. And if they're losing jobs, they can't pay fees. And if you add subsidy and fees together, that constitutes 90 to 92% of our income stream. And for me, that's the real challenge. When I go to, I'm going to SOAS at the end of the year. If you look at what's happening in SOAS, they are taking on a 15 to 20% cut in their budget, and they're cutting staff. They're cutting salaries. They're beginning to cut operational costs. If you look at the UK, there's something like 45 to 50 institutions that may potentially be bankrupt. And I don't think South African institutions are there yet, but that doesn't mean we can't get there next year and the following year. And we need a serious conversation as a system on the sustainability of our higher education system.
I mean, so often people look at the short-term consequences of something like a COVID-19. Immediately there's a health crisis. So you deal with the health crisis by imposing a lockdown. The lockdown causes an economic crisis. People lose their jobs, people get hungry, their food queues, and that's immediately evident. A year or 2 or 5 from now, 10 years from now, we deal with the consequences. I mean, just by way of example, the Syrian refugee crisis wasn't made last year or the year before. It was made 2001, perhaps, with 9/11. But actually, it wasn't made then. It was made before then. It was made in the 1940s with the division of Palestine, for example. I mean, all of the decisions we take today have got long-term consequences. And I think your point here is that this is just the beginning of considerably larger challenges, not only for academia, but for the country as a whole.
Absolutely. And I think that that's what, for me, is the real concern about debates today. There's a lot of anger around a whole range of questions. And the anger, in many cases, is entirely legitimate. the deep inequalities is not acceptable in our society. But we make decisions in the heat of this anger, and we make it emotionally laden. And the problem with is those consequences live with us for all. You know, I think it was Martin Luther King who said, there is a legitimacy for rage, for anger, but don't let that determine your choices. Because if you allow it to determine your choices, you land up making mistakes that live with us for generations to come. And it seems to me that it's on the economy, it's on the in the university system, it's about statues, it's about monuments, it's about every single thing that we're talking about today. Is we making decisions without the nuance, without the complexity of the conversation. And there's too much intolerance in that conversation and those deliberations for it to kind of land up somewhere that is thoughtful and has a long-term consequence.
I mean, at the time that we are recording this particular conversation, the Black Lives Matter protests have erupted across the globe. I mean, what is happening in South Africa is not particularly unique. There are people who are marginalized all over the world. They feel marginalized. They've been marginalized. America's seeing its biggest civil rights protest since the days of Martin Luther King as we speak. But in South Africa, it's accentuated. It's accentuated because of the issue of privilege. It's accentuated because of the issue of inequality, the deep unfairness of the structure of South African society. And maybe in January, we had a decent chance of fighting against that and getting some growth going. But right now, we've got Cyril Ramaphosa who's playing fireman to 100 different fires at once. And no sooner does he dampen one down over here than 99 others are flaring up over there. How worried are you, therefore, as a political scientist? I mean, you did politics at 3 universities. It wasn't good enough to do it in just one. How worried are you about the long-term consequences of what's playing out right now?
I'm worried at 2 levels. Firstly, I think that the deep inequalities are in South Africa, and you're absolutely right. South Africa is an extenuated version of the world. So the world is deeply unequal. And if you look at Piketty's book, Piketty says, we are as unequal today as we were in 1913, just before the First and the Second World War. And he argues that it was that deep inequality that created this deep social and political polarizations that enabled the emergence of particularly the Second World War. Mm. And so I think that exists in the global order, but I think it's extenuated in South Africa. And for me, that's a real problem. So I've been writing quite extensively about the emergence of proto-fascists globally, but in South Africa. Mm. And people get angry and they carry on saying to me, but why are you as a Vice-Chancellor doing so? Why do you do this? And I'm saying, well, you know, if we often accuse Germans and apartheid South Africans, whites in apartheid South Africa, of not being heard. Nobody must say that we were not heard in this historical moment. So I'm very worried about the social and political polarization. That's the first thing. The second is the economy. I think we've got deep problems in the economy. And I think that growth is really in a crisis. And I think as we come out of this, the big thing is how do we get growth, but simultaneously, how do we get inclusion? Now, you might say there's both possibilities and problems. The possibility is this. If you looked at it 2 years ago, 3 years ago, everybody was saying that if you need to get a growth strategy going in South Africa or anywhere in the world, your debt to GDP ratio must be very low.
Yeah.
That was the big thing, be in the 20s or this thing. Now nobody talks about it because what they mean by low is under 100%. Yes. That's what they mean by low, because people are sitting at 200 or 300%. So that's created opportunities. But it only creates opportunities if you know what to do with it. If you have a state that is incapable of executing, you've got a serious problem. This is the problem of Cyril Ramaphosa and Zweli Keys made very clever decisions right at the beginning. But they had no execution capacity because you've been what you've done to the state by cadre deployment for 20 years, you've denuded it of any of its capacity. So you say, we're going to deliver grants, and no grants that get delivered. You say, we're going to deliver food parcels, and somebody steals the food parcels. So that's your first problem. The second is you do have cash. People say there's no cash. Actually, there is pools of cash. Whether you like it or not, there's 2 trillion of cash, 2 trillion rand worth of cash in the pension funds, in the government pension fund. Here's the problem. Nobody trusts the government to use it, including the unions. They will not trust the government because they think the government will steal the stuff. So trust and execution paralyzes South Africa. That's the difference between Germany or, frankly, Taiwan. They're not paralyzed by execution and trust. We are. And that effectively is the most significant burden. I'll end up by saying one other thing, which I think is important. If you want to get this, we do have capacity. You know, if you go to South African breweries, within 2 days of the pandemic, they distributed alcohol to every shebeen in this country, in every township. There is a logistic capacity there. You want to deliver food parcels, they can get it out for you. So can Imperial. There's a whole host of capacities in the private sector. We just
Yet, I hear you and I could agree with you completely, but I'm going to throw white monopoly capital in your face because that's the response you're going to get. And I mean, I blame universities, frankly, for not educating young people adequately to think more broadly, because our thinking in South Africa is so siloed, is so vested in ideology and pain and anguish and all of the quite legitimate fears and lack of trust. But if we don't get a collaboration, and we've seen some great collaborations actually as through this COVID-19 crisis. I mean, CEOs I talk to tell me that they've never seen collaboration. Desperation breeds necessity. But as we get control of the crisis and stuff, I wonder if we then go back into our, dare I say, lagers, or maybe our silos in terms of personal interest, self-interest, and ideology once again. We run the risk of losing an opportunity to really work together to fix the problems that we have.
So Bruce, you see, I don't believe it's ideology. I believe it's political interests. So political interest that gets masked in ideology. And I think that that's the challenge. And I think the answer to that is to lead. Now, I go back to my example, and I know mine is an easier example. But in the midst of a challenge, you have to have 2 ideas. You have your eye on the social justice question. We want a more inclusive society. And you need a radical pragmatism. You need to operate in the world that exists. And what that means in a place like that is you listen to the interests and hear the interests of the 95% of people and not the 5% who are making the noise. And this is why you'll see I've ended a number of articles with the president saying, lead, Mr. President, lead. You know what needs to be done. I promise you, if you lead with an eye to the social justice question and a kind of pragmatism, the rest, the noise eventually quietens down. Because once you lead, ordinary voices are heard. They're coming to support me. When we were at the darkest hour at Wits, what did I do? I polled the students and said to them, here's the options, you tell me. And you know what? 80% of them said, we go with what you say. I went to the staff and I polled them. Don't listen to the noise. Lead in the interests of the 95% who are decent human beings. Don't feel paralyzed by the loud voices that are often political and often have their own interests at play.
And it's exactly that. But unfortunately, the social media world that we occupy is the one narrative that dominates. And because it is loud, because it's vociferous, because it's orchestrated, because it is very targeted, it is Bell Pottinger light, perhaps. I mean, Bell Pottinger taught South Africa the power of messaging. If you turn that around, however, and you use that same strategy as a leader, you can overwhelm the negative noise, potentially.
That's exactly right. So there's an interesting debate, and this is what I wrote 2 days ago. And that is, I was asking the question, is it appropriate for Cyril Ramaphosa to worry about the dignities of his office and not engage? I would love him to stand up and say, I've had enough of this. Here is what I am doing, and I'm acting in the interest of this. And for you who are racial essentialists, keep quiet. I was elected to be president. I'm going to lead, and and if you don't like it, go to the electorate in 5 years and put up your candidate. But I am leading. And he needs to tell that to the racial essentialists. He needs to tell that to the state capture crowd. He needs to tell that to the opposition parties. Lead, Mr. President, lead. And that means you can craft what you need to do in a package that I believe South Africans will buy. Trust them. Don't listen to the 5%. Trust the vast majority of South Africans, black and white, because I think they're decent human beings and they have the country's interest at heart.
I mean, you quoted Martin Luther King earlier, and I apologize for quoting Nelson Mandela because he is quoted so often, but what you're saying here goes to a very simple Nelson Mandela quote, and it's something along, it's only impossible until it's done, or everyone thinks it's impossible until it's done. If you consider the political transition of 1989 to 1994, it was impossible. I mean, South Africa was far more polarized back then, in a far worse financial state back then. We defaulted on our debts. South Africa was bankrupt, politically, morally, and socially. Yet leadership won the day back then. And I would argue that Cyril Ramaphosa has been given the opportunity, which he will squander at his peril at this moment in history.
That's exactly right. And I think he has the capacity. I think he has instinctively he's arguing instinctively for the right political project. He needs an alliance between state and business and civil society. He wants to chart an inclusion agenda, but one that is located in a kind of market economy. He wants to build, if you like, a social democracy. I think that's where most of South Africans truly are. And I think he's got there, but he has to lead. He has to craft his message and able to communicate it, and he has to have the courage to say to the EFF, to say to the DA, to say to the racial essentialists, Shlala Pansi, sit down. That's what he has to say to them. And that is what he finds difficult. But I promise you, he has to do it. If he does what Chamberlain did to Hitler in the 1930s, he'll allow them to re-emerge. The thing that you had to do in the 20s and 30s is to stare down the proto-fascist movements. Yeah, we have to stare down the proto-fascist movements, the Stalinists, and the racial essentialists. And they're slightly different groups of people. But you got to stare them down because their agenda is not social democracy. Their agenda is not an inclusive future.
Do we not see a global opportunity here? As much as I can now send kids to be educated anywhere in the world online, in the same way, kids from all over the world can get a value proposition, perhaps in South Africa, that they might not get elsewhere. Should we properly grab the opportunity of online education?
So we've got an opportunity and a danger. And the opportunity is effectively this. I don't think we'll, post this pandemic, simply go to an online world. Remember that the vast majority of people who go to Harvard are really at Harvard, not for what they learn in the classroom, but for the connections that happen, what happens outside the classroom. The reason that BITS produces, and I'm bragging here, why 60% or 65% of CEOs of South Africa come out of BITS, it's because of what they learn in the broader university community. They learn to navigate and learn a whole series of soft skills that operate in navigating this university, non-racial, multicultural, multi-religious community. And so universities are also about your physical connections, your physical interactions, and about the actual learning. And online does and enables the one part, but it doesn't do another. What I imagine is we go to something like a blended learning. Parts of your academic program are effectively in the online format, part of them will be in physical face-to-face interactions. That's the first fundamental shift. The danger is this, is we say to poor people, you get online education, and rich people, you'll get a blended. That, I think, is a danger, because you'll create a new form of inequality. So it seems to me that that's the first fundamental shift that is going to happen. The second is actually this. All of our challenges have gone global. Public health and the pandemic, renewable energy, climate change. And actually, to solve them, you need both great science and you need local knowledge. It's the combination that makes it happen. And that means if you want good human resource capacity in the middle of Burundi to deal with pandemics, you can't just train people in Oxford. You need an institutional capacity in Burundi to be able to manage this pandemic at its source. And so what you're going to shift towards is a new form of partnership globally, where institutions come together, and you might pick up learning by doing something in SOAS and Harvard and MIT and WITS and UCT. What you're going to see is a global network of institutions that trains the professionals of the world, that brings together great science and local knowledge to produce professionals that can address the global challenges of our time. And it seems to me that that's the second option, and that's what we need to prepare for.
I mean, if we just look at how divisive global politics is at the moment, you've just got to look at Brazil and Bolsonaro. You've got to look at America and Trump. You've got to look at the United Kingdom and Johnson and the Brexit movement. You've got to look at the neo-fascist movements emerging in some parts of Europe. You look at the really tough regime of China and North Korea. And you look at the divisiveness of global politics right now after 75 years of real global collaboration and the most peaceful era in human history, potentially cracking at the edges. Can academia operate differently in that world of divisiveness? Can there be this collaboration? I mean, there must be, but is it possible?
So history never progresses in a kind of unidirectional way. There's always, you take 3 steps forward, 1 step back. In that period of peaceful history, think about it. We had the Korean War, we had the Vietnam War, we had the Civil Rights Movement, we had the fundamental 1976 year. We had the civil war since the 1990s, including Libya, the implosion of Syria and the Middle East going up in flames. All of that also happened in this period. So what I see is, I don't think you can go back to an earlier era. I think globalization is here to stay. The real debate is globalization in how do we do this in a manner that is inclusive, that incorporates the vast majority? How do we do it how do we establish a more social democratic platform of a globalized world? That's the debate. Now, is that going to be a smooth ride? No, but I guarantee you that Trump will lose, Bolsonaro will fall, they will fall. Modi will eventually be transcended. Not immediately, but somewhere down the line. And that's the point. You know, when I heard, people said to me in 2004, Mbeki can never fall. In 2010, they said Zuma will never fall. The point is, history moves on. The charlatans are exposed for who they are. The trick is, we as a common humanity need to learn those lessons. You see, there are still people in the business world who say the business is the world of profit. That's all we should worry about. We shouldn't worry about social consequences. That's not the world you can live in, even if you wished it. Yeah. Because those protests on the streets of Seattle and New York and London and Johannesburg and Cape Town are not going to allow you to do that. Inclusion is not a wish anymore. It has to be an element of the very economic project we craft. And it seems to me that that's what globalization, that's the deliberation that we need to have as a global community.
Talk to me about SOAS and talk to me about how your swimming training is going, because at this rate, I don't know how you're going to get to your new job in the United Kingdom. You start in January at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. It's a huge feather in your cap after 30 years of South African academia to be given a role like that. They like your inclusivity. They like the fact that you've grown research capability at Wits. You've almost doubled that research capability. 90% of academic papers at Wits University have been internationally peer-reviewed in other journals. You've increased the revenues of Wits University during your time as Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor since 2013. That is a good CV to take to SOAS. What are you hoping to achieve? What's going to be different there from what you laid the bedrock for at Wits?
So ironically, SOAS is in trouble. It's in trouble financially, as I said earlier on, and it seems to me that that's something that I'm going to have to grapple with very early on in my tenure in London. But what I want to use SOAS for is, SOAS is the School of Oriental and African Studies. It's the UK's bridge to the world. It's its bridge to Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And I just spoke to you about, if we're going to address the global challenges of our time, we need to create a network of universities that does learning across national and even continental boundaries. SOAS could be the midwife of pioneering what that experience is. What are the business models to address that? And it seems to me that's the first big thing. The second is, for me, that humanities has always been taught in disciplines. And those disciplines have their roots in the early 19th century. It seems to me now you want to train people for the global challenges of our time. If you want to address climate change, you need climatologists, you need scientists, you need engineers, and you need humanities scholars coming together. And so what I really want to imagine at SOAS, in partnership with other institutions, how you bring a partnership between Imperial and SOAS, a technical university and a humanities university, on teaching new forms of gaming. One does the software, the other does the aesthetics and the storytelling. WITS and SOAS about governance and the new world order and how we reimagine it. UCT and SOAS around climate change. So I want to use that as a midwife to reimagine higher education in a post-pandemic world.
Adam Habib, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, your wisdom with us, and good luck with the swimming training if the aeroplanes aren't flying yet in December, when you need to make that transition to drizzly, miserable London. Enjoy the stay there.
Thank you, Bruce and Adam, for your independent and very honest insights. I'm the parent of an 18-year-old navigating matric. So the future of education in South Africa affects me personally, as it does many of our clients and our potential clients. While daunting for any parent or student for that matter, I'm refreshed by your dynamic approach to blended learning, classroom as well as face-to-face, online, which is relevant to all levels of education, not just tertiary. And I'm excited by the prospect of future inclusion. What excites me even more is the prospect of the end of homeschooling, which has been enforced on us. And I think for many of us, that idea always had some kind of, wouldn't it be nice if you homeschooled and saw our kids all day? I think we've all been cured of that over the last few months. Your passionate advice to this country in terms of leading and leadership also rings true, focusing on the interest of the 95%. To quote you, we should not be paralyzed by the other loud voices. And I think you'll agree that we've had a lot of loud voices over the past few months. And just because they're loud doesn't always mean they're right or valid. And we hope that today will make us more aware of that. I think it's important to acknowledge at this point that paying fees for any level of education in the current circumstances has created considerable strain. Dipping into savings as a temporary relief has become a reality for many. Unit trusts are a useful savings vehicle for any education-based financial goal. Funds are readily available. It's easy to withdraw the money when one needs it. One can lean on the expertise of experienced fund managers within a well-regulated environment, and the minimums are quite affordable. I would encourage using a unit trust solution that's backed by a reputable brand, a consistently implied philosophy, solid investment teams backing it, and a long-term track record. If I consider what I heard today, I'm grateful to my financial advisor who can separate out the current noise in the system from the ongoing responsibility and reality to pay such things as fees. PSG has the best independent network of financial advisors, both wealth and insure, a network that has been built up over years and that is incredibly difficult to replicate or find anywhere else. Through their expertise, your financial advisor can add a layer of certainty, structure to your decision-making, a layer of objectivity with consideration for various scenarios and the ability to adapt within a pre-thought-through plan. If you already have a PSG advisor, I strongly encourage you to engage with them, review your plan, see where you are. They're very well equipped to advise you both in terms of financial and insurance needs. And if you don't have a PSG advisor, please get in touch with us. On the events registration mail, you will find a link to get in touch with us. We welcome your feedback. These events are about you and providing value to you. So please communicate with us and look out for the next installment in our Think Big series.